How to use shutter angle on the Nikon Z8. Do you shoot video with the Nikon Z8? If so, you might be interested in shutter angle. Shutter angle is simply an alternative way to set shutter speed when shooting video so that the shutter speed is always some multiple of your frame rate. It can be useful to use shutter angle, especially when you are using multiple frame rates such as 30 frames per second, 60 frames per second, and 120 frames per second, all in the same project, and want to use a constant shutter angle. Of course, you don't have to use shutter angle. Some people find shutter speed more intuitive, and you can shoot video perfectly well without ever referring to shutter angle. So only use this feature if you think it's useful. Well, let's say you're shooting video at 30 frames per second. Then each frame takes 1/30th of a second. Imagine that 1/30th of a second takes up one revolution of a clock face. Now, the shutter angle represents the proportion of this time on the circle. For example, 90 degrees represents a quarter turn, so 1/120th of a second. 180 degrees represents a half turn, so 1/60th of a second. And 360 degrees is a full turn, so the entire 1/30th of a second. Most of the time, you want your shutter angle at 180 degrees, or the inverse of twice the frame rate. So 24 frames per second will give you 1/48th of a second, or 1/50th of a second when you're rounding it to the nearest thing available on your camera. 30 frames per second gives you 1/60th of a second. Yet, you might want a larger shutter angle like 360 degrees for a more dreamy approach, or a smaller one like 45 degrees to make the video more choppy to emphasize hectic, stressful movement as was done in the movie Saving Private Ryan. The general formula to translate shutter angle into shutter speed is as follows. But how do you use shutter angle on the Nikon Z8? First, you need to update your firmware to at least version 2.10. The earlier versions, including firmware 2.01, do not have this feature. If you have an earlier version, just go to Nikon's firmware update website, which is linked in the video description, and update your camera. Assuming you have at least firmware version 2.10, go to the pencil menu. Then go to G for video options. The option is under G13. If it says shutter speed, change it to shutter angle. Now, make sure your camera is in video mode and in manual too. Then, instead of shutter speed, you'll have the following shutter angles to choose from. This table shows the shutter angle and corresponding shutter speed at some common frame rates. Since many of these shutter speeds don't exist on cameras, this new table shows the nearest available shutter speed that will be set in practice. If you want to set and forget, just leave it at 180 degrees. Deviating from 180 degrees, higher angles are for dreamy, softer footage, and lower ones are for choppier footage. Keep in mind, of course, that in very bright outdoor conditions, you may need ND or neutral density filter, since your shutter speed will be quite low, such as 1/60th of a second for 30 frames per second. I hope you found this video helpful for shooting video on the Nikon Z8, and it actually also works on the Nikon Z9. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope to see you again next time.